One of the most beautiful flowers in all of nature is the sunflower. Like most crops and most plants of the field, it starts out as a very tiny sprout. But over time it grows into one of the most beautiful flowers in all of nature. You've probably seen some of these either in a field or on a painting of some sort. The reason that these flowers grow to be so big and beautiful is because they track the movements of the sun. The sun rises each morning in the east. And when the day begins, when the sun begins to rise, the sunflower is pointed in the eastern direction. And as the sun begins to rise throughout the day, so does the sunflower. The sunflower follows the movements of the sun. And at the end of the day, when the sun sets in the west, you can probably guess which direction the sunflower is pointing. It's pointing in the western direction to get the maximum contact from the sun that it can. And then the next day, when the sun rises in the east, the sunflower is there to meet the sun when it rises. And it does this day after day after day. Hence the name sun, S-U-N, sunflower. And that's the reason that it grows to be as big as it is. Stay with me. This video will talk about the topic stay with me, and how we as Christians are to be not sun, S-U-N, flowers, but sun, S-O-N, flowers, constantly seeking as much of Jesus Christ as we can get as we try to stay with Him as we walk through our Christian life. And what's beautiful about this text in John chapter 15 is the fact that when we seek Christ and we try everything that we can to stay with Christ, He will in turn abide with us. Before we get to John 15, though, let's examine the context of John chapter 15. You might recall in John chapter 13, Jesus washes the disciples' feet. The setting for this is in the upper room. Jesus is eating the most momentous Passover feast with the disciples, and He's talking to them about His impending departure from them. And He's telling them things like, don't be anxious. He's telling them things that I'm going to send a helper to you. I'm not going to leave you alone. I'm going to help you out. But at the end of chapter 14 in verse 31, after the Passover meal was concluded, Jesus said, "Get up and let us go from here." The indication being that Jesus and His disciples were going to begin the walk from the upper room into the Garden of Gethsemane, where, as you know, Jesus was betrayed and handed over to the chief priest. But what's interesting about this walk from the upper room to Gethsemane is that according to John chapter 18 and verse 1, they would have had to cross the brook Kidron. And we know from secular history, based on the things that are there, the streets of the brook Kidron would have been clouded with grapevines. These grapevines, especially during the Passover, would have been very fruitful. And it might just be that when Jesus is walking along, He looks at one of these grapevines on the side of the road. He may have even gone up and picked one of those grapevines off and turned to His disciples and said that I am the true vine. Another possibility is that on the walk to Gethsemane, on their left would have been one of the most magnificent structures in the ancient world, the first century Jewish temple. And on the front of the first century Jewish temple was a beautiful architectural rendering of a grapevine. It might just be that to jog their memory of Old Testament Scripture, Jesus pointed to that vine and said, I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine dresser. Regardless of what Jesus did to prompt their memory, this is what we call the seventh I am statement of John. In the Gospel of John, Jesus outlines 7 I am statements to indicate to His disciples and to His audience who He really is. And what He did was, in these statements, is He uses familiar imagery to them. For instance, in John chapter 6, verse 48, He talks about that I am the bread of life. And we can identify with what bread is. But grapevines for them in the first century would have been very familiar to them. As a matter of fact, the vine language is used often in the Old Testament. And it might just be that what Jesus is trying to do when he says that I am the true vine is to jog their memory about Old Testament Scripture. But what's interesting about John chapter 15 is that Jesus doesn't just say that I am the true vine. There's a place for you, and there's a place for me. And where do we fit in this? For time's sake, we won't be able to cover it all, but we can at least touch on the first idea of John chapter 15 and verse 4. The topic of stay with me, first of all, in John 15 involves a location. Jesus said in John 15:1 that I am the true vine. As we mentioned already, vine language was used very much in the Old Testament. As a matter of fact, there are two what we call songs of the vineyard, one in Isaiah chapter 5 and one in Isaiah chapter 22. And it might just be that Jesus is trying to get the disciples to recall those familiar verses of Scripture. Jesus is the true vine, meaning that Jesus is the source of life to those who abide in Him. So Jesus is the true vine. He also says in John 15 verse 1 that my Father is the vine dresser. Now we're not very familiar with that language, but that's just a fancy word for a farmer. God is the farmer. God is the one who is in charge of the vineyard. God is the one who makes sure that that vine produces the best fruit that it can. It might just be that it might be to make a profit, or it might be for consumption. But regardless, God is the one that's in charge of the vineyard. So therefore, what we can conclude is that since God is the farmer, since God is the vine dresser, He's going to do everything in His power to make sure that the vine and the branches have a chance to be successful and to bear much fruit. God's going to make sure that His vine is productive. And all we have to do, as this class will discuss, all we have to do is stay with Jesus to produce life and to be fruitful. John chapter 15 and verse 2, Jesus goes on to say that since God is the vine dresser, the branches that don't produce fruit, God will cut those off and burn them. In other words, they're not useful to the vine. But those branches that bear much fruit by abiding in the true vine, by staying with Jesus, those branches will be pruned or cut back so that they might produce more fruit. The fact of the matter is that we are the branches. There's a location for us in this story about Jesus. We are the branches. He is the vine. All we have to do to grow as He would have us to grow is to stay with Him every day of our lives.